Alrighty. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Alvaro Calle. I'm currently serving as the DC Area Director for our WDCSITE section. We've got, a great round of presentations today and tomorrow. Today we'll kick it off with one, and don't forget to come back for tomorrow in the link that we've sent for the other rounds of presentations. So yeah, just for now, I'll kick it off to our Assistant Area Director, Asonga Hong.
All right, thank you, Alvaro. Welcome to 2023 WDCSITE February virtual meeting. Today, this meeting is for the last annual meeting, WDCSITE ITE has received several submissions for the Project of the Year awards, and we have received amazing submissions, and we had amazing candidates. And today we would like to use this opportunity to have the candidate present on their topics, on their projects, and have meaningful time to discuss with our team. So like Alvaro said, we have two sessions. In today's session, we have one presentation, and it's running from 12 to 12:30. We have a couple of housekeeping items before we begin. This meeting is being recorded, and all attendants are muted during the presentation session. And we will have a 10-minute Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Please type in the questions that you might have at any time during the presentation. At the end of the presentation, we'll go through them to address them. Or during the Q&A session, feel free to raise your hand using the raise hand button in Teams. I will call for your name, and you go ahead, unmute, and ask questions to speakers. And 1.5 PDH credit will be provided to the attendees who attended both of the sessions today and tomorrow. After the session tomorrow, we will follow up. We'll email you with the link to the ITE website where you can log your PDH credits. Also, after the session tomorrow, we will also distribute the link to the video record as well as the copy of the presentation slides. So please look out for our follow-ups. All right. So without further ado, we are pleased to introduce our speakers. We have three speakers for today's presentation. Will Handsfield. Will is a transportation planner from District of DDOT, specializing in building the protected bicycle network of Washington, D.C., and has worked in D.C., California, and Colorado for 17 years in various roles related to bicycle, pedestrian, and transit planning. Will lives with his wife and 3 children on Capitol Hill, living a car-light lifestyle by biking, walking, and taking transit. Our second speaker, Iain Banks, is a transportation planner at Nelson and Nygaard, and leads their DC office with 20 years of experience in sustainable transportation. Iain's projects have included campus master plans, sustainability plans, citywide bicycle master plans, citywide parking programs, and community planning. He brings experience in both the public and private sectors, previously serving as a transportation planner for the city of Annapolis, Maryland, where he was responsible for the city's parking properties and active transportation networks and their access to the transit system. Iain is an expert in multimodal transportation planning, ensuring that the transportation network supports the community goals of mobility, economic vitality, and healthy living. Our last third speaker, John Crisafi, is a senior engineer with Kittelson and Associate with 10 years of experience in transportation operations and design. He has expertise in traffic operations analysis, signal and roundabout operations and design, long-range plan, bicycle and pedestrian operations, and microsimulation. His area of expertise are in signal design and microsimulation, including multi-resolution corridor modeling to small single intersections and roundabouts. John has contributed to project as both project manager, task manager, and designer/modeler for a wide variety of projects within the DC, Virginia, and Maryland metropolitan area. So Will, Iain, John, please welcome our speakers. Floor is yours.
Great, thanks. And I think John's going to be running the slideshow for us, so hopefully you can keep up, because we have a lot of slides here and we have a relatively short amount of time. So thanks for joining us today. The first presentation of the 2022 candidates is obviously our 15th Street Northwest Bicycle Improvement Study, and this was a project that there was a consultancy team led by Nelson Nygaard, along with Kittelson, Inspire Green, EXP, and ATCS, working alongside Will and his team at DDOT, as well as the National Park Service as well. We have a very brief agenda for you today, just beginning with how we sort of brought transportation equity via planning into this study, how we consider different users in design, and then Will and John will go into the design considerations, actually getting it done, and the impact of the work as well. So, in terms of how we've begun to centre transportation equity through planning here, we know that why protected bike lanes and why in this particular location. I mean, I think we all know that we ideally, DC is looking to that future where there is a low stress tolerance for bicycle users, and so we can begin to get those interested but concerned riders into the system and perhaps using bicycles for their everyday activities. DC right now is sort of somewhere in between that and gradually improving to that slow stress tolerance. In terms of the work that we were doing on the 15th Street corridor, as sort of most of our projects, right, we begun to look at the existing conditions, evaluation, how do people walk, scoot, bike, roll and drive, where are crashes happening, etc., before moving into the design and 100% design of interim improvement plans, with a 30% design of sort of more longer term improvement strategies that perhaps would occur once those interim improvements are evaluated, and then ultimately can be completely designed in that 3 to 5 year time frame. Of course, MPS is a large stakeholder within the corridor that we're looking at, and so how did DDOT and MPS also continue to improve and maintain those improvements as well? So the corridor itself, it's sort of the 15th Street safety improvements, 15th Street from Pennsylvania Avenue down to Main Avenue. And if we begin to look at that, it sort of begins to take into not only DDOT roadways, it takes into MPS roadways, and a forthcoming MPS project to the south of Main, which is installing a cycle track all the way to the 14th Street Bridge. And so really this project sort of began to take a look at that sort of missing link on 15th Street between Pennsylvania Avenue and Main Avenue. And this sort of is born out of almost a decade plus of planning. It was incorporated in the National Mall Plan, it was in the Move DC Plan of 2014, it was in the Paved Trail study from MPS in 2016 as well, and really begins to sort of fill in this missing link both locally as well as regionally within sort of that central CBD area of DC, heading out into North Virginia as well. And it's certainly confirmed through big data as well, as we begin to look at the shared scooter heat maps and the capital bike share maps, as well as Strava that you can sort of begin to see here. The 15th Street corridor is one of those vital connections, not only for everyday activities for commuting and getting into the central business district, but also for tourists as well. It's certainly right there in sort of one of sort of the nation's capital's most iconic corridors. So how did sort of this begin to get funded in terms of the design? It's DDOT were creative and sort of begin to look for funding to sort of have these odd ownership and legal divisions as it relates to MPS and DDOT, and the Federal Lands Access Program sort of enabled them to use funding for not only improvements of safety, but improvements to multimodal access as well. And it enabled DDOT to actually own the project management and spend those funds on federal land. So it was almost a win-win situation for DDOT as well as MPS moving forward. In terms of who we've begun to consider in sort of in the design, we knew that we were trying to accomplish three things: safety, ease of use, and then begin to sort of balance that access and delay as well. And we know that there's multiple ways that people were getting around within the corridor. As we mentioned before, it's rolling, it's scooting, it's transit, it's personal vehicle ownership. Lots of different user groups that we had to entail here, including visitors, who are certainly an important user group here. There's 3 bus laybys that we had to incorporate along the National Mall on the west side of 15th Street. There's a DC circulator route. There's the big bus sightseeing companies that begin to use these laybys. And they all really needed to be sort of considered, because there are sort of multiple conflicts that we've begun to see throughout the corridor, and particularly at sort of the major intersections of Independence and Constitution on 15th Street. So we certainly had to sort of align with them as well. Looking at the crash data, you can see there sort of as we began our study in 2020, looking back from the previous 5 years, there's 200 plus crashes within the corridor of multiple types, all of which could generally be minimized to a certain extent through better design. If we began to look at sort of why we wanted to begin to shift space for fairness, you can see the picture on the left-hand side there of cyclists beginning to use the sidewalk, and there's a runner in there, and no dedicated space for any particular user or any non-auto user anyway. Whereas the picture on the right-hand side begins to show that after fact of once the project was actually implemented as well. And again, you can begin to see why sort of shifting this space begins to make sense. And the sort of the pictures that we have there are both after the fact of and these are actually from different users that we sourced from online activity, social media, of people being actually using these facilities once implementation was undertaken as well. And this is always a good one, sort of new space, new constituencies. The actual 15th cycle track was actually a completion portion of the East Coast Greenway as it moves through DC. It's actually making people realize how implementation and design can actually be done correctly, done relatively quickly. And as Michael Bradley said there, it completely changed the way that people begin to look at streets and what can actually occur once things are done correctly. But what we wanted to do, sort of from a coordination perspective, is really to make sure that we had equity between different uses as well. You can see here, this is a before picture. They're amongst parking, riders are amongst parking, they're amongst regular travel lanes. We knew that there was curbside space uses going on, certainly through this portion of between Pennsylvania and Constitution as well, where there's food and souvenir vendors and there's tour bus parking. And so being able to sort of make sure that those uses were also considered and able to be relocated. They were relocated relatively close to their existing locations. And it was ultimately a decision by DDOT to sort of make sure that the curbside use was being used correctly and for the highest and best use, which wasn't necessarily being vending for that purpose, but being able to make sure that those people that have their living on a daily basis were not put out of business and they were actually relocated. And with that, Will can begin to go into a little bit more of the design considerations that ourselves on the team, as well as DDOT, went through.
Yeah, thank you. I think John's going to take this. Yeah.
Okay, sorry, John.
Yeah, but I think you and I could probably also interject on all this. So when looking at actually designing this,
John, you're muted.
of course, I gave my first like 30 seconds up to muting. So I guess maybe when I play the video, it mutes me. So just believe that this actually is a live action shot of folks enjoying the tidal basin, our new facility, during the Cherry Blossom Festival last year. But from the outset of this project, one of the conditions that we had was we wanted to try to keep everything within the existing curbs. So similar to a lot of the rapid deployment of improvements around DC, this was sort of viewed as sort of like a paint and post type project where we wouldn't be moving any hardscape, and we try to be allocating everything within the existing paved footprint of the roadway along 15th and the cross streets as needed. And then as Iain alluded to earlier about like trying to make sure that we provided the correct modal accommodation for transit and bicycles namely, but this also has some peripheral benefits for pedestrians given that this is a pretty high pedestrian and non-motorized user corridor. So let's see here. So looking first at the transit accommodation, Iain had talked about that there are 3 bus laybys along the corridor, so 2 kind of like on either side of the Washington Monument, and then 1 further down the street, just across from Bureau of Printing and Engraving. And one of the things that we were looking at was, well, this conflict really here with the cyclists kind of hugging the curb and then having bus conflicts kind of coming across a two-way cycle track was first seen as like, well, maybe that's something we could think through a little bit. But then as we started iterating, what are the situations, what are the conflict points, what are the realistic situations that would come there, we realized that that really was not going to maximize the real benefit of the corridor and really achieve the goals of what we're out to do. So this actually shifted a bit to accommodating a little bit more of a more robust design, and that included developing these floating bus islands, which is, if you've been out there in the last like year and a half, you've probably noticed. And so this is kind of like a good before and after shot. So this is the northernmost one just south of Independence at Madison Drive, where before they had this sort of like narrow median to separate where the bus lay-by was to the sidewalk. And so what we did is we actually created these bus platforms that are floated on the other side of the two-way cycle track, which we indicated with sort of like clear pedestrian markings, making sure that all the ADA alignment of both ramps. So there's 2 ramps at either one of these bus islands, and then to make sure that they accommodated a couple things, not just dwell time for folks at the circulator or the big bus, but also given the mall is sort of a marquee location, needs to be able to accommodate loading and unloading of event equipment, so stages and tents and audio equipment, things that go on the mall throughout the year. So it was requested that we make sure that we are able to accommodate those elements, but then also to make sure that it wasn't too big. I think as a lot of us work on sort of hardscape and final design projects, anytime you adjust sort of the square footage of a certain amount of shift in what could affect drainage, that could have a chance to like kind of bump it up to the next level of effort. So it was also making sure that we were right sizing these to make sure that we were achieving all our goals without going overboard and having to actually rethink a lot of design inlets. So despite all this on all these 3 islands, we did not have to change any of the drainage or catch basins along 15th Street. This was all able to be done. And again, the outside footprint of 15th Street remained as is after the implementation of this. So here's a couple other pictures of the bus islands at Independence and Maine after they were completed. And then actually this weekend, we actually got to see them in use. So taking a look at this, I like this shot because it actually shows that, first of all, our cycle track is not just used by cyclists, but also by scooters, scooting. Also, if you're out there, especially during like high tourist season, you'll see a lot of segways and things too. But what this illustrates is that we kind of, in terms of equity and providing space, like we literally provide space for everyone in this photo. So quite literally, the transit vehicle has a space. This is pulled out. This is a bus-only lane, separate from the general traffic lanes. We have more than enough space for pedestrians and transit riders to dwell as they load and unload on the big bus, completely separated from the non-motorized wheeled vehicles on the cycle track. Also a gorgeous day this weekend if you guys were out there. All right. So going a little bit more into that bicycle protection, so providing that space. one of the things that we wanted to make sure that we had was a very clearly defined barrier along the entire extent of the project that we were working on. And this had to have a variety of strategies. I think ideally we would have wanted a single solution through all this, but as we'll get into, we had to get a little bit creative through the different segments. So we kind of had like three major strategies. So basically, at the fundamental level of buffered width, so we made sure that we tried to maintain about 2 to 3 feet of actual space between the white lines from general traffic. And then in terms of vertical elements, utilizing some of these like rubberized zebra wheel stops within the National Park Service extents, we were able to install the long-term solution, which is sort of like these module concrete precast barriers, basically in the extent north of Constitution here. And then ultimately, along this National Park Service is to replace these rubberized wheel stops with actually a very similar median to what had existed previously out there, separating the bus bay from general traffic. So the reason we have sort of like an interim condition and an ultimate condition is that National Park Service is slated to repave this extent of 15th Street, I believe, this year. That's correct, Will? Yeah. You're muted, but I'm assuming that was a confirmation.
Yes, confirming there that FY23 is the repave year, and John.
Oh, you just muted again.
There is. It was very difficult to sort of adjust what pieces of equipment we're going to use depending on the block and who owns it and who is doing maintenance work and some of these other things. So luckily we were able to align DDOT's full repaving of our segment of 15th Street with the installation of this project, so we could put in what we think of as the final end state equipment on that part of the corridor. Those large concrete blocks are 2 feet wide. They weigh about 1,500 pounds each. So we just decided we were going to wait on doing something more permanent for the NPS portion because one, it's right next to the Washington Monument, and we thought beyond just like the concrete blocks, they might want something even nicer and in a higher level of design, which they're working on now to get the final design on that. But also just the timing, as anyone who works in engineering and transportation can attest, like getting things to align is half the battle. So I want to commend John and Iain on their team for coming up with a pretty nuanced equipment and installation plan for our what we call our interim solution, because it was different every block and had some real unique things depending on who was doing road work and when they were doing it.
Yeah, thanks, Will. And I think also to kind of like build onto that, so these rubber wheel stops, while do a decent job in some parts, noticed when we were out there this weekend that they get hit, they get twisted, and they get kind of like ripped off even with the rebar. So some of them have actually been replaced with actual concrete versions. So it's the same geometric shape and dimensions of this, but it's just a concrete version rather than the rubberized wheel to try and make that a little bit more robust along the way there. Here's some other sort of examples of this implementation. So this is along Main Avenue. So previously, for those who may have rented one of the paddle boats down here by the tidal basin, there was a third lane here that we just never introduced. So it was an add lane further upstream down the hill. So we just simply removed that and consolidated everybody in the 2 lanes for that through continuity on Main. And then also wanted to try and keep vehicles out of this cycle track. I think anyone who's in the sort of bicycling community, or at least on social media, probably has no shortage of pictures of people parking like quite literally across like cycle tracks or in bike lanes. And so providing these yellow delineator posts along there is meant to keep people out of that, especially given the context of where this is. A lot of people like to pull over, take pictures. So we wanted to make sure that was clear for folks using the cycle track. So not just with physical protection, but also protection in time using traffic signal phasing coordination. So definitely in the contraflow direction, so northbound relative to the southbound vehicles adjacent to that, we wanted to make sure that we provide bike signals at all key locations. The sort of geography of this was unique in the sense that there's only a couple cross streets that we really had to be mindful of, given that it was mostly along sort of like White House property, Ellipse property, and then against the Washington Monument as well. So, but the real kind of fun design came here at the sort of the cycle track to cycle track situation. So for those who are familiar with the Pennsylvania Avenue cycle track in the middle of the road, this was a tricky one to figure out. Not a lot of examples of cycle track to cycle track, particularly cycle track to cycle track where one is on the side of the road and then the other is in the median of the road. So we had to go through a couple design iterations to really kind of figure this out. And ultimately what happened is we had gone back and forth with protected phasing and bike only phasing, but then rested on the utilization of the bike box and trying to really overlay the bike movements within the existing phasing pattern actually. So this did require updating a few of the signal heads out there to make sure that we accommodated that and making sure all bike movements had visibility of their signal indications. But we were able to kind of overlay that in there, which was good for the DDOT traffic folks, but then also made all of our connections, which was great for the folks trying to maximize the bicycle connectivity and safety for that. In addition to that, so looking at the bicycle connection, utilizing sort of good information about how to use the bike box. So if you're actually turning, we tried to make this as big and prevalent as possible for folks to recognize that if you wanted to go down Pennsylvania Avenue, wait there and then wait for your bike signal, and then that'll get you looking at the plan view here overhead into the eastbound Pennsylvania Avenue cycle track. So I'm going to hand it off to Will to wrap us up here, and this will be more of the getting it done between DDOT and the other agencies.
Thank you, John. Pleasure to be here. So as I mentioned before, we had a couple of different repaving schedules, a couple of different segment owners. So DDOT owns between Pennsylvania and Constitution. And in projecting the work, we were able to synchronize it with another team of ours, Asset Management's full repaving of the street. And the way that we often work with them is we make a deal. If you repave this street, we will put in all the markings. So they save a little bit of cost on their end, and then we're able to avoid the eradication of markings, which is a noisy and somewhat difficult step to do, especially on a busy street next to the White House in this case. And then because of a couple factors, we were able to limit the amount of eradication on the area south of that's NPS ownership. In general, we designed all this in 2021, implemented between the late 2021 and finished in 2022. And so we were able to just look at sort of these interim conditions that we were going to have, and with the eye to not making them permanent throughout the entire quarter, because as I mentioned, we knew NPS had a repaving coming up 2 years later, but making sure that we had a functional facility in the time between when we were finished with this design and when NPS would come back and make a permanent granite buffer protected facility. And I think one of the key things that's really important is it's very easy to spend time in transportation, it's delays and things like that. And we were really committed to having a deliverable very, very quickly, and we're able to achieve that. And the biggest challenge was putting in probably these granite bus laybys because they were a large feature that needed to be fully constructed. But John's team was able to get us a really excellent design. We were working with two different contractors, one that did the concrete installation, and we made that a really quick and almost seamless installation because of just everyone's coordination between everything. If you want to go to the next slide, Iain. The impact has been really profound about how we've seen ridership change. We don't necessarily have great before ridership because most of it was happening on the sidewalk and not in the street. But once we got a counter up in the first year of the facility being online, we were tracking about 1,200 to 1,500 daily riders on. And this is even before kind of like the summer peaks. I think it's probably higher now based on what John and I saw in the field. But around 100 morning hour peak riders, 200 and probably pushing 300 now PM peak. I think when it's summer or cherry blossom season, we'll see that 500-600 riders in the peak hours. It's really been amazing to see how broadly used it gets. I think if you go to the next slide, we have some photos, and you'll see lots of cyclists, certainly. You'll see a lot of scooter riders. You'll see Segway riders. We saw skateboarders. You see all kinds of people on these different mobility devices like one wheels. I've seen people using motorized wheelchairs in the facility, and again, keeping up with the same speed as your general rider. And we've done all this without having a deleterious impact on the vehicle traffic throughput of the corridor. So in general, everything works about the same way on the vehicle side as it did before, with one fewer lane for the entire thing. And it's by being selective about where you have a 4 or 5 lane cross section, right? We had that before. So now we'll have essentially the same capacity at intersections for the key direction. And then have maybe instead of 2 receiving lanes, we'll have 1 receiving lane at the intersection. But it usually is enough, and has been really interesting to see the overall traffic effects not be really any worse. But we're also accommodating all these new users in a really fair and equitable way. And if you go to the next slide, one of our VIP new users is Secretary Pete. He mentioned it in an article related to how he gets to meetings at the White House, and so we're excited that one of our the highest officials in our field is actually using this stuff on Capital Bike Share, no less, so one of our other programs in the city. So it's been a really interesting and rewarding project for all of us who got to work on it, because it's one of the few that just almost immediately you saw a high use. You saw the connections it was making to the 14th Street Bridge. So now we have an interjurisdictional connection that was really quite difficult before, and really catering only to something like the commute riders. And now we're able to cater to a much broader cross-section people for many more uses. So with that, I want to thank everybody for having us and considering this project. It was a pleasure to work with everybody on the team, and we hope to bring more of the same type to the district in the next few years. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Will, Ian, and John. Thanks for the great presentation. We are passing 12:30 for a few minutes, but if you could stick a few more minutes, we have one question coming in. Do you think you could take one question?
Yes, I think we can take
right.
however many you're willing to give us.
Sounds great.
Yeah.
So one that came in is, are the cycle tracks to be considered as a bike lane, or are they being considered as a shared use path that anyone can use it? Is this planned to be for skateboarders, scooters, electric bikes? Would there be any regulations for it?
In general, we consider this a protected bike lane, cycle tracks being a subset of protected bike lanes, indicating a two-way facility, two-way on the same side of the street. In general, it's not a multi-use path in this regard. Multi-use paths are for pedestrians as well. That's really the only sort of user that's not intended to be in this cycle track. We in all of our bike facilities in Washington, D.C., among the people allowed are Segway riders, scooter riders, skateboarders, rollerbladers, and then inclusive of all these sort of like one-wheel devices or other sort of mobility devices. So it's a broad category. Basically, anything that's rolling on wheels is welcome. I think the pedestrians, there's a natural conflict in the type of locomotion, and there are conflicts inherent in that. In this case, we have very wide and generous sidewalks nearby, and part of the deconfliction of the corridor was getting the many wheeled users off the sidewalks and into a dedicated space, and I think we've largely achieved that in this corridor. So hopefully that answers the question.
Thank you. So we have couple more questions. We have one in the chat and a couple more in the Q&A section. Since we're running out of time, what we're going to do is we're going to hold on to the questions, and I'll copy all those questions myself, and we'll follow up with the people who asked questions so we could address them offline. All right. So with this, thank you again. With this, I'll conclude today's session. I thank you to everyone who joining the call today, and thank you to all our speakers. Tomorrow we'll have a second session starting from 12 to 1 p.m. And a quick reminder for tomorrow's session, you will need to use different link to access the session. So in the invitation email, there will be 2 separate links to the 2 sessions to make sure that you're using the right link. If you have any questions, please reach out to me or our board members. Thank you again. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it, Sangha.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.